The sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet suburban morning, followed by Martha Holloway's piercing scream. Diane Rutherford, known to everyone in Sunnyside Estates as the most notorious HOA Karen in suburban history, was already marching across her perfectly manicured lawn, clipboard in hand, before anyone else had even opened their front door. Her crisp beige pantsuit pressed and immaculate, Diane's steel-gray eyes locked onto the scene with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. The Johnsons' son had accidentally thrown a baseball through the Petersons' living room window, and Diane knew this was her moment. Rule violations were her specialty, her lifeblood, her absolute passion. "I've got 7 copies of the incident report already prepared," she muttered to herself, a thin smile creeping across her lips. The neighborhood knew Diane Rutherford as the ultimate enforcer. At 52, she had transformed the Sunnyside Estates Homeowners Association into her personal kingdom. Every lawn measurement, every fence height, every exterior paint color was scrutinized under her relentless gaze. Her weekly newsletter, the Sunnyside Sentinel, was less a community update and more a manifesto of micromanaged regulations. What the neighbors didn't know was that Diane's crusade ran deeper than mere rule enforcement. She had a secret, a meticulously crafted plan that had been years in the making. The HOA wasn't just an association to her, it was a battlefield, and she was its unquestioned general. Tommy Johnson, the 12-year-old baseball thrower, looked terrified. His father was already pulling out his wallet, ready to pay for the damages. But Diane wasn't interested in money. She wanted accountability, documentation, and most importantly, submission. "This is a clear violation of Section 4, Paragraph 3 of our community bylaws," she announced, her voice cutting through the morning air like a razor. "Recreational activities must be conducted in designated areas, and designated areas most certainly do not include front yards where projectiles can cause property damage." Mr. Johnson opened his mouth to speak, but Diane raised one perfectly manicured hand. Silence. The other neighbors began to emerge from their homes, some with coffee mugs, others still in pajamas. They knew the drill. When Diane Rutherford appeared, you listened. You didn't interrupt. You certainly didn't challenge her. What they didn't realize was that this morning's incident was just the beginning. Diane had been planning something far more significant than a simple baseball window replacement. Her clipboard wasn't just for show. It was her weapon, her strategy map for total neighborhood domination. Behind her immaculate facade and seemingly bureaucratic obsessions, Diane Rutherford was playing a much larger game. And today, she was about to make her first move. As Tommy Johnson stared at the ground, his baseball now confiscated and tagged with an official HOA incident report number, nobody noticed the slight tremor of excitement in Diane's hand. Not a single neighbor suspected the storm that was about to be unleashed in Sunnyside Estates. The morning sun cast long shadows across perfectly trimmed lawns, and in that moment, everything was about to change. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for precisely 7 o'clock p.m., and everyone knew better than to be late. Diane arrived 20 minutes early, her leather-bound community bylaws manual tucked under her arm like a sacred text. The community center's fluorescent lights gleamed off the polished conference table, reflecting her meticulously prepared documentation. Mark Henderson, a software engineer who'd lived in Sunnyside Estates for just 18 months, was about to make a fatal mistake. He'd been researching the neighborhood's property records, digging into something Diane thought was long buried. "I have a motion," Mark announced, his fingers gripping a manila folder that made Diane's right eye twitch involuntarily. The room fell silent. Longtime residents knew that unsanctioned motions were about as welcome as a lawn ornament painted outside the approved color palette. Greg Wilson, the HOA treasurer and Diane's longtime ally, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "The floor recognizes Mark Henderson," Diane said, her tone as sharp as a freshly sharpened landscaping edge trimmer. Mark stood, his hands slightly trembling. "I discovered some irregularities in our community's property ownership records, specifically concerning a series of land transactions that occurred 15 years ago." Diane's perfectly pressed blouse suddenly felt 2 sizes too small. Her fingers, adorned with a modest diamond wedding ring, gripped her pen so tightly the plastic creaked. "Irregularities," she repeated, each syllable measured and controlled. Behind her carefully constructed facade, Diane's mind raced. She'd spent years crafting this neighborhood into her personal fiefdom, carefully maneuvering through property transactions, HOA regulations, and community politics. And now this nobody, this newcomer, felt he could challenge her. Mark continued, oblivious to the tension crackling through the room. "I found documentation suggesting that certain property transfers were not fully disclosed to the community. There are questions about how some of our common areas were actually acquired." Greg Wilson coughed. A few residents exchanged uncomfortable glances. Diane knew she had exactly 3 minutes to shut this down. Her reputation, her entire carefully constructed world, depended on maintaining absolute control. One crack in her armor could expose everything she worked decades to build. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice a measured weapon of bureaucratic destruction, I'm sure you understand that community records are complex. Perhaps we should discuss this privately after the meeting. But Mark wasn't backing down. He pulled out a series of documents, photocopies that looked official, crisp, and potentially devastating. I think the entire community deserves to hear about these findings, he said. The fluorescent lights seemed to dim. The air conditioning hummed with unexpected intensity, and for the first time in 15 years, Diane Rutherford felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Genuine fear. Outside the community center, the streetlights flickered. A stray dog, which would absolutely be in violation of Section 7, subsection C of the HOA bylaws, wandered past the window, casting a long shadow across the parking lot. Something was about to break, and Diane knew it might very well be her. The morning after the explosive HOA meeting, Diane's routine was anything but normal. Instead of her usual power walk around the neighborhood, cataloging potential violations, she was hunched over her home office computer. Stacks of old property records, yellowed and dog-eared, surrounded her like a fortress of paperwork. Mark Henderson's investigation had struck a nerve deeper than anyone could imagine. Her fingers traced the edges of a faded map, a relic from 15 years ago that she kept hidden in her most secure filing cabinet. Each line, each property boundary told a story she'd hoped would never see the light of day. The original land purchase, the subsequent subdivisions, the careful maneuvering that had transformed Sunnyside Estates from a simple suburban development into her personal kingdom. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Greg Wilson stood on her front porch looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. He was clutching a manila envelope like a lifeline. His usual confidence evaporated. "We need to talk," Greg said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Diane stepped aside, allowing him entry. Her living room was a testament to her personality. Everything in its precise place, color-coded throw pillows, and not a single item out of alignment. Even her decorative plants seemed to stand at attention. Greg dropped the envelope on her pristine glass coffee table. The documents Mark frowned. "They're worse than we thought." "Worse how?" Diane's voice was calm, but her right hand, the one with the diamond ring, had started to tremble almost imperceptibly. He's traced some of the property acquisitions back to shell companies. Companies that lead directly to... Greg stopped, swallowing hard. A car drove by outside. A child's bicycle leaned against a perfectly trimmed hedge. Everything looked normal. But in Diane's world, normal was just a carefully constructed illusion. "To what, Greg?" she pressed. He pulled out a series of documents from the envelope. Property transfers, financial records, incorporation papers, a paper trail that had remained hidden for years. Each document was a potential bomb ready to explode her meticulously crafted world. "To you," Greg finally said, "most of Sunnyside Estates, it's technically owned by companies that all trace back to you." Diane had always known the risks. When she first moved to the neighborhood 15 years ago, she'd seen an opportunity, not just to live in a community, but to control it completely. Strategic purchases, carefully worded HOA bylaws, endless meetings, it had all been part of a larger plan. And now, that plan was unraveling. Mark Henderson wasn't just a random software engineer who'd stumbled onto something. He was a threat, a significant threat to everything she built. "We need a strategy," Diane said, her mind already racing through potential countermoves. "Something to discredit him, to make sure these documents never see the light of day." Greg nodded, but his usual enthusiasm was gone. For the first time, he looked genuinely afraid of the woman he'd helped maintain control of Sunnyside Estates for so many years. Outside, a sprinkler system clicked on, spraying water in mathematically precise arcs across a lawn that was exactly 2.5 inches tall, per HOA regulations, of course. Mark Henderson's home office looked like a war room. Corkboards covered in property maps, sticky notes, and interconnected red strings created a complex web of information. His wife, Elena, an investigative journalist, watched him with a mixture of concern and fascination. "You're obsessed," she said, sliding a cup of coffee across the desk. Mark didn't look up. "Someone has to be." "Do you know how many shell companies are involved in this property network? It's not just about Sunnyside Estates. This goes deeper." The investigation had started innocently enough. A simple property tax discrepancy had caught Mark's eye during a routine software audit for the county. Most people would have ignored it. Most people weren't Mark Henderson. A notification pinged on his computer, an encrypted email from an anonymous source. Alina leaned in. Another tip. The email contained nothing but a set of GPS coordinates and a timestamp from 15 years ago. The same year Diane Rutherford had first moved to Sunnyside Estates. "This isn't just about HOA violations anymore," Mark muttered. "This is about something much bigger." Meanwhile, across town, Diane was making her move. She called an emergency HOA board meeting, ostensibly to discuss Mark's baseless accusations. But Greg Wilson knew better. This was about damage control. The community center's conference room felt like a pressure cooker. Residents whispered, stealing glances at Mark, who sat quietly in the back. Diane stood at the podium, her pantsuit pressed, her demeanor calm, too calm. Mr. Henderson has raised some concerns, she began, her voice smooth as silk. Concerns that we will now address transparently. Transparently. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Greg shifted uncomfortably. He knew the bodies buried in this particular metaphorical graveyard, and none of them were going to stay underground much longer. Mark's phone buzzed. Another anonymous message. This time, a single line of text. Check the old Miller property, southeast corner, midnight. Alina looked over his shoulder. Are you going? A dangerous smile crossed Mark's face. Absolutely. The night was moonless when Mark arrived at the coordinates. An abandoned property sat at the edge of Sunnyside Estates, surrounded by overgrown grass that would definitely violate HOA regulations. A rusted gate hung partially open, as if inviting or warning him to enter. Something moved in the shadows. Mark hesitated. Every investigative instinct told him this was both an opportunity and a trap. Diane Rutherford didn't leave loose ends. She didn't make mistakes. And yet, here he was. The first step onto the property made a sound like a gunshot in the silent night. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a sound that would absolutely be a violation of Section 9, subsection B of the Sunnyside Estates HOA bylaws. Diane was watching. Somewhere, she was always watching. The old Miller property was more than just an abandoned lot. As Mark's flashlight cut through the darkness, layers of hidden history began to reveal themselves. Concrete foundations peeked through overgrown weeds, and rusted chain-link fencing suggested something more complex than a simple unused plot of land. A mail envelope lay conspicuously on a weathered wooden stump. No markings, no return address, just his name printed in precise block letters. Mark's fingers trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside, a series of property records, land surveys, and corporate registration documents told a story far more intricate than any HOA violation. Each page connected to the next like pieces of an impossible puzzle. Diane Rutherford wasn't just managing the Sunnyside Estates HOA. She had been systematically acquiring property, creating shell companies, manipulating local zoning laws. The last document was a handwritten note. Some secrets are better left buried. EM. EM, the initials, meant nothing to Mark. Not yet. Back in her home office, Diane was conducting her own investigation. Her computer screen flickered with background checks, property records, and communication logs. Mark Henderson wasn't just a random software engineer. His digital footprint told a different story. Greg Wilson entered without knocking, something he'd never done before. "We have a problem," he announced. Diane didn't look up. "We always have problems, Greg. This is different." Mark's wife, she's an investigative journalist, and she started asking questions with the local county records office. A thin smile crossed Diane's face. "Then we'll have to give her something to find." The next morning, Alina Henderson received an anonymous email. Digital forensics would later confirm it originated from a complex network of proxy servers, making tracing impossible. The email contained what appeared to be confidential documents suggesting Mark had been involved in a previous corporate fraud investigation. Completely fabricated, of course, but just credible enough to raise questions. At the Sunnyside Estates Community Center, tension crackled. Residents picked sides. Some supported Mark's quest for transparency. Others, most actually, sided with Diane. She kept property values high. She maintained order. Who was this newcomer to challenge her? Mark stood at the center of the storm, clutching the documents from the Miller property. Something wasn't adding up. The land acquisitions, the shell companies, the carefully constructed facade of community management, it all pointed to something bigger. Much bigger. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled up outside the community center. No license plates, no markings, just silent, menacing presence. Mark caught a glimpse of a figure inside. Watching. Always watching. The game had changed, and Diane Rutherford was about to discover that controlling a neighborhood was very different from controlling a secret. The county recorder's office was a labyrinth of paper and digital archives. Alina Henderson moved through the files with the precision of a surgeon, her journalist's instinct telling her she was close to something significant. "Can you pull the original land transfer records for Sunnyside Estates?" she asked the clerk, sliding a carefully worded request across the counter. What she didn't know was that her request had triggered an alert. Not with the county, somewhere else entirely. Miles away in a climate-controlled server room, a phone rang. The number was unlisted, the caller ID blank. Diane Rutherford answered on the first ring. "We have a situation," a voice said. Male, professional, completely emotionless. She didn't respond immediately. The pause was calculated. "Containment or elimination?" "Containment," the voice replied. "For now." Mark, meanwhile, had been digging deeper into the Miller property's history. The land itself told a story that predated Sunnyside Estates by decades. Old survey markers, buried property lines, mineral rights that seemed to snake underneath the entire development like hidden veins. His latest discovery sat on his computer screen. A series of geological surveys from 30 years ago. Something about underground water rights. Something about mineral deposits. Something that made absolutely no sense in a suburban housing development. A text message arrived on his phone. No sender. Just coordinates. The location was the abandoned Miller property. Again. Night fell quickly. The suburbs transformed into a landscape of perfectly manicured shadows and motion sensor lights. Mark's car rolled slowly down the street, every movement calculated. He knew he was being watched. Alina called just as he approached the property. "Something's wrong," she said. Her voice was different. Tense. "The county records, they're not adding up." "What do you mean?" "I mean entire sections are missing. Pages have been removed. Digital records scrubbed. It's like someone went through and systematically erased specific information." Mark pulled to the side of the road. The Miller property loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the suburban landscape. Something moved in the shadows. Not an animal. Something deliberate. A drone, small, compact. Watching. "I'm going in," Mark said. "Mark down." Elena's voice cut off. The call dropped. The property gate stood open. An invitation. Or a trap. Diane Rutherford's office was immaculate. Stacks of documents. Carefully organized. But her computer screen told a different story. Lines of code. Encrypted messages. A network far more complex than any HOA could possibly manage. This was about something much bigger than community rules. Much, much bigger. And Mark Henderson was getting closer to the truth with every step. The Miller property was never just a piece of land. As Mark's flashlight cut through the darkness, he discovered a network of underground tunnels that seemed impossibly extensive for a suburban development. Concrete walls, electrical conduits, something that looked like an abandoned communications hub. This was no ordinary HOA secret. A steel door, partially hidden behind decades of overgrowth, caught his attention. The lock was modern, incongruously so against the aged concrete and rusted infrastructure. Mark's software engineering skills came in handy. A portable device he brought began probing the electronic lock's security systems. 10 minutes later, the door clicked open. Inside, rows of servers hummed with a quiet intensity that felt almost alive. This was a data center. Hidden. Deliberate. Connected to something far more significant than Sunnyside Estates. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You're not supposed to be here. Walk away." Mark smiled. He'd never been good at walking away from a mystery. Meanwhile, Elena had been tracking a different trail. The county records she discovered were Swiss cheese with deliberate omissions. Property transfers, mineral rights, water access. Something fundamental was being hidden. Back in her home office, Diane Rutherford was orchestrating damage control. Greg Wilson sat across from her, looking more nervous than ever. "How much does he know?" Diane asked, her voice as cold as polished marble. Greg swallowed, enough to be dangerous. The truth about Sunnyside Estates wasn't just about property management. It was about control, strategic acquisition, something that went far beyond a typical suburban development. Mark downloaded server data, his fingers moving rapidly across his laptop's keyboard, encrypted files, communication logs, financial transactions that made no sense for a simple HOA. A sound behind him. Footsteps. He wasn't alone. The underground facility was larger than he'd initially thought. Multiple corridors branched out, lined with equipment that looked more like a government black site than a neighborhood management center. "Mr. Henderson," a voice called. Professional. Controlled. Mark turned slowly. A man in a perfectly pressed suit stood at the end of the corridor. No name tag. No identification. Just a presence that suggested he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "You're asking questions," the man said. "Questions you shouldn't be asking." Mark's hand inched toward his phone. And what questions might those be? The man's slight smile didn't reach his eyes. The ones about what's really underneath Sunnyside Estates. About why Diane Rutherford was chosen to manage this particular development. Chosen. Not hired. Not selected. Chosen. Outside, the suburban night continued its perfect manicured facade. Streetlights clicked on with mathematical precision. Sprinklers activated on schedule. Everything in its place. But beneath the surface, something was moving. Something that had been waiting. Watching. And Mark Henderson was about to discover exactly what that something was.